Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. I'm Patrick Cummings, here as always with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week we aim to simplify the principles and practices of nutrition, health, and fitness. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hello, E.C. How are you?
Great. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. We're going to break down a new study that recently came out about polyunsaturated fats versus saturated fats. Yeah? I got that right? That much
you
I
did.
understand.
You know
Everything
some of
after
your
this
fats.
is going to be... Everything after this is a question mark for me, but that much I got. All right, before we jump in though, EC, you're going to be running a coach's masterclass, and the next cohort starts on January 5th. It's coming up soon. So if you're a coach out there looking to level up your nutrition coaching skills with evidence-based practices that actually work, this is for you. Head to optimizemenutrition.com/masterclass coaches to learn more and to save your spot. We will put that link in the show notes, but again, optimizemenutrition.com/masterclass coaches. All right, EC, let's do a little bit of background. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, you got it right. We're talking about polyunsaturated fats, and those are really the fats that are high in seed oils. And so that's why we're bringing it up, because seed oils are all the rage on social media and have been for quite some time, versus consuming saturated fats. And those are the ones that are high in animal foods. And I thought this study was pretty interesting. It's always worth mentioning that when we talk about foods that are high in one fat or high in another type of fat, that fat is always a mixture in these foods. Almost always. There's some exceptions like everything in nutrition, but nevertheless, there is always some mixture, so it can get very confusing. But generally, when we look at different sources, they kind of slant more towards having high polyunsaturated fat. Again, those are the fats high in seed oils versus saturated fats, which are more animal-based. And so just seeing this study, I feel like it's another nail in the coffin. I mean, I feel like we've got a lot of nails in the coffin on these viral diet videos online that say like seed oils are really harmful and problematic and all of the fear mongering about that. And then that really pushes people to believe that animal based is better. And I'm not against meat and I'm not against some animal products, but I definitely think that the research shows that we shouldn't be pushing people towards unlimited consumption of animal fat. And one of the things that you kind of hear online in this viral social media space is that, saturated fats aren't harmful, when in reality, we keep having very consistent, strong evidence that saturated fats can increase your bad cholesterol, bad in quotes, and then that can increase your risk for heart disease. And really the risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, which is that buildup of plaque in the arteries, and that, of course, can block blood flow, and that's what can lead to the heart attacks.
Okay. Got it. Maybe first thing first would be talking about the study a little bit. What was it? What did they find? Perhaps why it's important?
Yeah, so this is the heart study in the show notes. It came out, a month or two ago, and it's a meta-analysis. Of course, we love those, and it's on randomized controlled trials. So pulling together lots of different research, and of course, it's trials on humans, and we're pulling together what they found. And they're looking at different fats in the diet. And they were actually looking at all three. So we already mentioned the polyunsaturated and the saturated, but there is the third type of fat, monounsaturated. And then really kind of breaking it down of what happens of the different levels of fat relative to one another. And so they really honed in on looking at, okay, well, what about the ratio of polyunsaturated fats, again, seed oils, to the ratio of saturated fats in the diet? And so they had 24 trials. And because these are randomized controlled trials, we really can say that the outcome is causal instead of sort of saying it's associated with or it's linked and there might be other variables for it. With randomized controlled trials, we're able to say like, no, this variable caused the outcome. And what did they find? They find that diets with a higher ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated lowered cholesterol. Now that's kind of confusing, so let's say it another way. The more polyunsaturated fats in the diet, and the less saturated fat in the diet, the lower the overall LDL cholesterol. So said another way, the higher the seed oils in the diet and the lower the animal fats in the diet, the lower the bad cholesterol. And so again, lowering LDL cholesterol, or the quote bad cholesterol, is generally a good thing because high levels of that bad cholesterol increase that risk of heart disease. And again, like I mentioned, it's just another study in a very long list of studies showing that seed oils or these polyunsaturated fats are not the problem, and they're really the more healthy options to choose, especially when they replace excess saturated fat from animal fat.
Okay, so the concerns about which type of these fats is quote unquote better is largely based on their effects on LDL because that's what affects disease risk. Am I
Yep, that's
sort
the
of getting
link.
that chain right?
That's the chain.
Okay.
That's the pattern. And yes, we can say that LDL cholesterol levels are a causal, independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. I think what gets really confusing and hard about this topic is I'm talking about eating certain types of fat, and then we're talking about certain cholesterol levels in the blood. And the cholesterol levels in the blood actually are molecules that not just contain cholesterol, but they contain cholesterol, protein, and fat in them. And then it's the fat on these cholesterol molecules that are ultimately part of the problem that creates the plaque. So it's really easy to get confused here because it's like, okay, we're eating fat, they're on cholesterol molecules, but then the fat that's on the cholesterol molecules is part of the overall problem. But I do want to give a little bit more detail about these factors and how it ultimately links to heart disease. And again, like all 25-minute podcasts, we're not going to be able to cover all of the details, but just this very basic, maybe too simple overview, but certainly helpful as a backdrop. We've got these two main cholesterol molecules in the blood. Again, those are the LDL and the HDL. And when we measure our cholesterol, these LDL and HDL molecules also have fat and protein on them. They're not just cholesterol. LDL, the bad one, that's the low density lipoprotein. And it's known as bad because it carries cholesterol from the liver to the arteries. So it's bad because the arteries are what can get blocked. And so if you're taking cholesterol from the liver to the arteries, we're thinking, heck, we don't really want it out there. And that's why we consider it bad. Now, of course, we need some levels, but nevertheless, that's why it gets its bad name. And then HDL is the high density lipoprotein. This is known as the good one because it's what carries the cholesterol from the arteries back to the liver. And of course, that would mean like, okay, we're taking the cholesterol out of circulation so it doesn't have a chance to end up forming those plaques. And that's why it would be considered good. Now, I mentioned that this LDL is bad because it's carrying the cholesterol out to the arteries. This is where those cholesterol molecules can penetrate the artery wall to start the formation of the plaque. Now, why would they penetrate the wall? Well, things like having a high blood pressure or smoking, or even just having high cholesterol itself, having lots of these molecules around, can damage the vessel wall, making it more susceptible for these LDL molecules to get inside, basically get lodged in them. And then once inside the blood vessel wall, it's the fat molecules being carried on that cholesterol molecule that can oxidize. Essentially, oxidize means it changes from its chemical form. And that oxidation process of those fat molecules is really the triggering event for the artery clogging process. The immune system's like, what are these molecules? And they seem to be damaged. What's going on over there? So the immune system releases its inflammatory signals, which bring over more cells. And then ultimately those cells can start to form the plaque. That plaque can burst. That can lead to a blood clot, which ultimately blocks the artery, blocking blood flow, and we have a heart attack. So it really is a domino effect that ultimately starts because these LDL molecules are getting lodged into the wall. And you want to think about it as like the more LDL molecules I have going through my bloodstream, the more of a chance there is for them to get lodged into a wall. It's almost like I have more cars on the road to get into a heart attack or something. To get into a car accident. So I mentioned that some of those fats oxidize, and that's kind of this damaging signal to the immune system to start that whole other second part of the cascade. The fats that tend to oxidize first are the polyunsaturated fats, which, yes, are the ones high in seed oils. So this is where some of the people who say seed oils are so problematic will point to. They're like, okay, these fats are really susceptible to oxidation, and so that's why we should keep them out of the diet. But we have to look at why those molecules got there in the first place. And they got there in the first place because they had to be carried by the LDL cholesterol molecules, which brings us back to now saturated fat. Saturated fat ultimately decreases LDL receptors on the liver. There are LDL receptors on the liver to capture the excess LDL in the bloodstream, therefore reducing LDL in circulation. But increasing saturated fat decreases these receptors, leaving more LDL in the arteries, leaving more of these molecules at action, shall we say, to run into the wall and to get lodged, and therefore start the triggering event of the oxidation of the polyunsaturated fats. And so again, we just have this consistent evidence including this study that I just mentioned, that saturated fat in the diet is related to the amount of LDL cholesterol levels in the blood. And then we have all of these other factors like your blood pressure, whether or not you smoke, for example, affecting the quality of your artery walls, your genetics, your family history, that are really going to form the overall picture for whether or not these LDL molecules turn into those kind of plaques that rupture and then can cause a heart attack.
Okay, so why is this so controversial? I think is the thing I keep coming back to in my head. Like, what is the primary argument of the saturated fat is good camp, and why does it run so counter to everything you just laid out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things. Unfortunately, there are people with MD and PhD after their name making wild claims like we have no evidence that saturated fat causes heart disease. And, I get it for the layperson. It's just a kind of a he said, she said battle. But to try to help explain kind of my position a little bit more, when people say we have no evidence that saturated fat causes heart disease, that's not entirely true. Now, you could pick some studies that you like and say that they go against the narrative that I just said, but we always have to remember that one study doesn't prove anything. Heck, 2-3 studies don't prove anything, particularly depending on the limitations of the study. And so it's always about what does the entire body of evidence say. And we do have a good amount of clinical trials from like the 1960s and into the 1970s that definitely get called into question and are part of the mess in trying to untangle this for people and trying to understand it. And these studies are what like Paul Saladino, who's, the big carnivore king, I guess we could say, and then also like other people who are really into carnivore, they'll often cite to this handful of studies to basically say that saturated fat is not the problem. And the 3 studies you'll typically hear about are the Minnesota coronary study done in 1968, the Sydney Diet Heart Study in 1966, and to a lesser degree, the Rose Heart Study in 1965. But I did actually track down some posts recently where Saladino mentioned, I think, all 3 as kind of his comeback to somebody saying that seed oils were more beneficial. And his point is that these were human clinical trials, which in fact they were, and they were comparing increasing polyunsaturated fats to saturated fats. And these 3 studies, when doing that, did not reduce the risk of cardiovascular events. And even in one of those 3 studies, the higher polyunsaturated fats increased the risk of heart events. So exactly the opposite of what I said. Basically, that he says that the seed oils are not just like neutral, but really harmful. And so this is what he points to say that, okay, seed oils are, quote, bad. But this is where you really have to dive into the details of the study to understand the quality of the data. And there was a review by the American Heart Association in 2017, we'll put that in the show notes, that does that quite well. But they discount the credibility of these 3 studies that Saladino cites to quite frequently for different reasons. The primary one being, at the time the studies that these were done in the 60s and 70s, late 60s, we really didn't have the knowledge about trans fats. So here, we're not onto another type of fat. Trans fats have since been banned because we do know that these are the most harmful fats of all in terms of increasing the risk for plaques and heart attacks. And trans fats were in the oils used at the time to replace saturated fats. So the researchers unknowingly were giving subjects a more risky fat than saturated fat when they were increasing the polyunsaturated fats in the diet. They were basically giving polyunsaturated fats and a blend of trans fats. So this is a problem. We can't make conclusions about polyunsaturated fats when the fats in the experiment were really a mix of trans and polyunsaturated fats. And so this is true for the Minnesota coronary study and the Sydney heart study. The Minnesota heart study and the Rose study are also plagued by the fact that most of the participants weren't in the study long enough to really evaluate the effect of fat on heart events. And so the 2017 American Heart Association paper explains that you need to have at least 2 years of exposure to, let's say, a new level of fat or a new type of fat in the diet to really reflect a change in your risk. Because we have to remember that heart disease isn't something that, okay, I just had, 3 hamburgers and now I have a plaque. It doesn't develop in a month or a day. It develops over our lifetime. So we really need to have a minimum of 2 years of exposure to start being able to make kind of conclusions about the influence of a diet change on heart disease risk. And so the average time in the Minnesota experiment was just a year, and in the Rose study, it was just a year and a half. And so they really both weren't long enough to be able to be conclusive. And so the individual outcomes in those studies are more likely a reflection of their diet before the experiment, to be perfectly honest, because we just didn't have a long enough time in the experiment for those conclusions. And there are other issues with those studies as well. But this is one of the reasons why I think it's so hard for the layperson. It really does end up being this he said, she said. I mean, Saladino says that, okay, these studies say, and then here I am saying these studies say. But it does take a lot of time to untangle this stuff. There isn't one study to prove anything. There's a lot of stuff that you have to go through and understand, okay, why am I going to not really rely on this data? It's not just like, oh, I ignored that study. But when you come to find out that a study was including trans fats, which we all, I think, have agreement on, I think even Saladino would agree on, we want to avoid those, then we kind of have to throw out that study as a primary piece of evidence about seed oils. And so this is what gets it's hard. I think a lot on social media is like this one study. And you have to remember that true experts are really looking at, I don't even know, hundreds of studies once you look at randomized controlled trials as well as mechanistic studies as well as association studies and so on to really come up with the kind of the final answer, we'll say.
It strikes me as odd that at least the 3 or 4 studies you just listed were all from the 60s.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a coincidence or it's just convenient for him because those are the ones that say the things he wants to say, so he's got to go all the way back to the 60s. But hasn't there been more recent data that's than arguing over these 3 or 4 studies that you just listed?
Yeah, there certainly have. The study, for example, I mentioned in the beginning, there's lots of those. There's lots of randomized controlled trials. There's association studies looking at people's diets and what happens to them in terms of their heart attacks. There's what happens to people on statins and their LDL levels and what happens to them with heart events. There's the ability to look at people who have genetically low cholesterol, all this stuff. I do think you hit the nail on the head, though, that they're convenient studies for him to use as evidence. And, to be perfectly honest, from the layperson perspective, they're pretty convincing. They were human clinical trials done for, let's say more than a year at least, right? Yep. So, and if you were to read the abstract, it's going to say something along the lines of polyunsaturated fats increase heart disease risk. But you really have to go into the methods and be like, okay, what were the oils that they were using? And why do we know that this is now a problem based on what was the oils that were manufactured at the time? So, I think it is a very convincing study on the surface, and you really have to take a nuanced kind of pause look to understand why you wouldn't want to use it. But yeah, I think the other thing is we wouldn't really be able to redo the Minnesota coronary study today, even without trans fats. Because who's going to be signing up for a 2-year plus clinical trial where we're going to control all aspects of your diet? It's really not practical. These studies were often done unknowingly with people because they were hospital patients. So, okay, where are we getting this clinical trial where people are signing up voluntarily for 2 years for us to control their diet? And then also now what we know with the body of evidence about LDL, saturated fat, et cetera, we also can't force people into taking a diet that we know is more risky. That would be unethical. So, it is kind of calling up the studies that are probably what we would like to design if, for example, we didn't cause any negative health outcomes. So in that sense, you can kind of see why he keeps going back to them. I will say what we do have in the modern era, which is like a randomized control trial, and we have talked about them very briefly, but they're the Mendelian randomization studies. And it kind of gets complicated again for the non-biology person, but Mendelian randomization is effectively like running a randomized control trial, but we're looking at genetic markers. So do the genes that control for lower LDL cholesterol levels result in less, and these people having less heart events, heart attacks, etc. And looking at genes is essentially like doing a randomized controlled trial because of the way that we inherit genes, which is at random. We receive one of the 2 copies of a gene randomly from our parents, and then all the other influencing factors like our diet and environment that are usually confounding factors in observational and association studies, they also randomly distribute with the genes. And so this is a way that if we find people who have certain genetic markers and certain health outcomes, that we can actually say that the gene has a causal role. It's basically like assigning them to a low saturated fat diet for life, but it's their genes are controlling it. And so, yeah, this is the Ferenc study in the show notes that basically shows that have genetically lower LDL for life have a significantly reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. And so this might be kind of our best long-term version of a randomized controlled trial in kind of our modern day era compared to what kind of the studies that Saladino keeps bringing up.
Okay, I want to ask you about what we should all do with this information. But before we do, just out of curiosity, is there anything that the more saturated fat equals better camp is getting right? Anything worth mentioning before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I don't think we need to fear it. I think that we can have some levels of saturated fat in the diet. I do know that there are some people that encourage no saturated fat. I don't think that's necessary. So I think that that's good that we don't have to go back to what the 80s and only eat rice cakes. But I do think the other thing that they do get right is I do think we are eating too much seed oils. I do think that we are eating too much polyunsaturated fats, even though I think that these studies are showing that they're generally beneficial. What do I mean by that? We're eating too much, period. We're eating 700 calories more per day than the 1950s. You name the ingredient, we're eating too much of it. Are we eating too many food dyes? Yes. Are we eating too much gluten? Yes. Are we eating too many carbs? Yes. Are we eating too many polyunsaturated fats? Yes. Are we eating too much saturated fats? Yes. Are we eating too much protein? Yes. You name the ingredient, we're eating too much of it. Maybe besides like potassium and magnesium, some of the the micronutrients or fiber. But anything else that has a caloric value, we're eating too much of it. And anything else that appears in these ultra processed foods, like the additives, it's not the additives per se, but we're eating too much of them because we're eating too many of those foods. So I do think that, people who cut back on seed oils, they often feel better, let's say, or they often see weight loss, but it's simply because they're reducing foods that they're eating too much of that have calories as well as these seed oils in them. So in some sense, they get that right. And if people were to take anything away from that, it's like, hey, I shouldn't have as many processed foods in my diet.
Got it. Okay. Wrap this up with what the takeaway advice you have for us. What do we do with this information? What do we do with this newfound understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, no surprise, comes back to being able to apply it with my 3 pillars method. I think that aligns well with a lot of people's weight, health, and fitness outcomes. I try not to be dogmatic about the 3 pillars method, but I'm like, yeah, I mean, this answers a lot of the concerns that people have. And one of the ways that the 800-gram challenge is so useful for people with their cholesterol levels, and I've worked with many, many, many people at this point, their cholesterol levels have shifted. And I don't want to say that it's going to be a cure-all for people, but if you are somebody who will respond with diet to get your cholesterol levels down, this is a great approach, in part because the 800-gram challenge, just by its volume, often helps displace calories, and because of its displacing calories, it's often helping displace saturated fats. You're now eating fewer calories overall in many cases, which means you're just having less saturated fat in the diet. In addition to that, though, there are some specific constituents of the fruits and vegetables that have like their own unique action for cholesterol levels, and one is fiber. Fiber, as it's in your GI tract, just prevents the absorption of cholesterol itself as well as saturated fat. Like, it will bind to it and prevent its absorption. So even if you are, let's say, eating a hamburger, not as much of that saturated fat will be absorbed when you eat it with the fruits and vegetables. Now, please, everyone out there, don't get obsessed with always eating things in pairs. But the idea is fiber in your diet overall can help some of that binding. And then this is super interesting too. The molecules that are produced from the gut microbiota that does break down some of the fiber, these molecules, we've talked about them before, called short chain fatty acids, they can also help decrease cholesterol mechanisms by a few different mechanisms, such as encouraging the liver to increase cholesterol uptake, taking it out of the bloodstream. So then we've got the fiber doing its thing, besides the fact that 800-gram challenge is just displacing calories overall. And then we also have the phytochemicals. So again, the phytochemicals are these thousands of plant compounds. We don't really know what they all are. We don't really know what they're all doing. The phytochemicals can interfere with the absorption of cholesterol, so just less overall cholesterol in the body. And so this is ways that different compounds within the fruits and vegetables kind of have an additive nature to improving people's cholesterol level above and beyond the fact that they might be decreasing their calories overall. So I find that, especially for people who are interested in lowering cholesterol, that the 800-gram challenge is a great first step to see if somebody that you are going to be responsive to diet changes for your cholesterol levels, for sure.
Okay. Thank you so much, as always, EC. Folks, 2 more quick reminders before we go. If you're a coach and you want to work with EC and with the 3 Pillars Method to help folks with their nutrition, sign up to be alerted as to when the January cohort of the Coaches Masterclass is going to drop. OptimizeMeNutrition.com/masterclass. Coaches is the place to go. And then if you're not yet subscribed wherever you're listening or watching this episode, please do, so you don't miss a future episode. EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.